Hello everyone, and welcome to Biopedia. Back in episode 86, we discussed the phenomenon of namesaking. This was mostly discussed in the context of parents naming children after themselves. However, there is an extension of this which we could discuss today, which would still fall within the umbrella of anthropology. Namely, the practice of naming sons after their fathers could lead to chains of names. For example, there is someone around today called Theodore Roosevelt VII, the seventh in a line of continuous father-to-son transfers of the name Theodore. This got me thinking, how common or rare is it to see a given suffix? To answer this, we are going to need some publicly available datasets. To start with, let's look at 2 townships in the 1790 US Census. And no, I'm not going to look at the entire 1790 census for the purposes of this episode. After all, there are almost 4 million people included in it, and I think we can all agree that this is too much data for just one episode of Biopedia. I have, however, digitized the data for Brookfield and Danbury in Fairfield County, Connecticut. So, today we will be looking at this data specifically from a suffix perspective. Now, this is more anthropological as opposed to purely biological. That said, I do have an idea in my head to host a second episode looking at the statistics of other aspects of the data I have so far collected. In essence, what's happened is I'd started digitizing this data more generally, and I thought hosting some content on Biopedia would be a good way of doing something useful with it. Think of this as an informal part 1 of sorts. Now, let's turn to the data. In Brookfield, there were 9 people with the suffix junior and 1 with the suffix the third, in this case Joseph Smith III. Meanwhile, over in Danbury, there were 31 people with the suffix junior and 5 with the suffix the second. Now, this might sound like a dramatic increase. However, Danbury had 557 heads of family recorded, while Brookfield had just 189. So you can see, even without doing statistics with it, it's somewhat proportional in terms of an increase. However, Danbury had nobody with the suffix the third. So, out of a combined sample size of 746 named people, who are the heads of families, mostly men it has to be said, there were 45 people labelled either junior or the second, and 1 labelled the third. I think we can all agree we can see a bit of a drop-off there. However, given that I don't have the full data set ready to go, I don't feel confident drawing any other conclusions than that. All well and good, but this would only give us 2 steps in our chain, the second and the third, which wouldn't really be enough to draw a trend line from. So, let's look at a different data set now, namely the governors of different states of the United States. If we add all 50 US states together, there have been a total of 2,491 terms of office. Note that this does not mean that nobody has held the office of governor more than once, but it shows that we're talking about a much larger sample size than just our 2 towns in Connecticut in 1790. Across all of these terms, there were 136 people who had some form of junior or the second as a suffix. We then get 30 labelled the third, 3 with the suffix the fourth, and 2 with the suffix the fifth. Of these last 2, 1 was governor of Maryland and 1 was governor of Virginia. In the latter case, Benjamin Harrison V, who was the father of US President William Henry Harrison. Now, there are some assumptions that I'm skipping over. For example, somebody with the suffix the second might not be named after their father, but instead another relative, thereby breaking the chain. However, I'm ignoring this for simplicity's sake so we can end up with some straightforward numerical data. Besides, the intention of namesaking and suffix chaining is there anyway. The great thing about getting data like we just did is that we can now turn it into a trend line on a graph. If you plot the data we just got on a graph, you get an exponential decrease. In other words, the probability of an ever-increasing chain length of names decreases towards 0. The equation for the exponential trend line given in this chart is y equals 2351.5 e to the power of 1.496x, where x is the suffix represented as a number and y is the frequency of occurrence. Don't worry, I'm not expecting you to remember or even write down this equation, it's just there for interest. What this means more generally is that we can take our crude trend line and formula and apply it to real-world examples to ask just how rare are certain numbers to occur. Let's take Theodore Roosevelt VII, for example. On our graph, an x value of 7 translates to a y value of 0.06659, or about 2042 times less common than Junior or the second. Meanwhile, as another example, there is a claim on Reddit, although I don't know how well founded it is, that there is a line of descent that has reached the 15th. My trend line on the graphing software Desmos has reached 0 at this point, so its usefulness really stops there. But for comparison, the 13th is held to be 136 million times less likely than Junior or the second, using the graph we made earlier. The same zero effect would also go for the 18th, which I also saw claimed on this same subreddit. So, there you have it. This episode has been less about the psychological effects of namesacking and more about how often it occurs as a phenomenon. This is more cultural and anthropological in its outlook than many other episodes of Biopedia have been, but hey, I hope at least it's been interesting for a change. That brings us to the end of today's episode. As always, thank you all for listening. Feel free to get in touch at the show's email address if you have any questions, comments, or topic suggestions for future episodes. Until next time, have a great week, everyone.